Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife Podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. I'm delighted today to welcome back Dr Kathryn Mannix to the podcast. Kathryn's first interview was titled Talking About Death, because that's exactly what we did. And Kathryn spent many years as a palliative care doctor, and she wrote the best-selling book With the End in Mind. Today we're talking about her latest book called Listen, How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations. Welcome back, Kathryn.
Rachel, thank you. What a pleasure to talk to you again.
I'm so excited to have you back here, and I just absolutely loved the book Listen, and I think it should be required reading for everybody. And I think actually that everybody should listen to you read it, because as I just said to you, the listening experience of Listen is sublime. It is so beautiful. You are the master storyteller, both in the written word, but also in audio, So I was saying to you, I think you've got a new career as an audiobook writer. But first of all, so I'd like to ask you, did you enjoy the process of reading your own book?
Oh, great question. It was a bit of a mixed bag. Partly because it was recorded during August during the heat wave, and in a recording studio, you've got to turn the air conditioning off. So I was absolutely sweltering. The crew, though, in the recording studios are absolutely fantastic. Just a really brilliant. So shout out for East Wing Studios. They were superb up in Newcastle upon Tyne. And you'll know this from your own book, that you can't read the audiobook till the text for the book is finalised and it's gone off to press. So you've written this book, you've read it, you've slept it, you've breathed it, you've lived it, you know it inside out. And then you sit down to read it systematically out loud down a microphone, and then suddenly think, well, that's a clunky sentence. Oh, no, I've already said this. I think this might be the fourth time I've made this point. Oh my goodness, who wrote this thing? So I was incredibly kind of self-critical towards the end. I was thinking, oh no. So the lesson for me was, if I ever write another book, if I ever say I'm going to write another book, Rachel, tell me to stop there and then. But if I do, at the end when I think it's finished, I obviously need to sit down and read aloud. I think the thing that I discovered that I think we probably all know but haven't realised that we know is that reading in your head is different from reading aloud.
You see, that's what I did. I did read mine out loud as I went through it and as I did the final check. And it is very powerful to do that, yeah. So, but honestly, it is, I'm going to use that word again, sublime. I mean, it is so beautiful. And you read it so well and with so much feeling. So everybody just get the audiobook version of this amazing book, because it's fantastic. So why did you feel you had to write this book after you'd written the first one?
Well, I was a bit surprised to find I'd written a second book, if I'm honest. I thought that I'd written With the End in Mind, which was really my giving dying back to everybody, the wisdom that I'd kind of absorbed from everybody else over 40 years, from medical student to retirement. And I thought that was it, really. I saw myself as a doctor who happened to write a book rather than as a writer. And then, of course, With the End in Mind became a bestseller, which I'm still coming to terms with, to be honest. And then, of course, my publishers were very keen to have another book. And I kept saying, no, there isn't another book. I said what I came to say. And then the correspondence started. And this was the thing that changed my mind. So two different sorts of correspondence, really. The correspondence that really confirmed that With the End in Mind had done or was doing what I'd hoped it would do, from people saying, oh, you know, I've been alongside somebody as they were dying. And that experience that you describe of being unconscious but making really strange breathing noises, for example, I didn't realize they were unconscious. I thought they were suffering. I thought they were drowning. I thought they were choking. So lots and lots of letters of thanks and kind of witness to say, yes, what you describe is what I saw, but I thought either it was unusually peaceful or I didn't understand that the person was unconscious. So I thought it was terrible. I was traumatized by it because nobody explained. So that made me even more determined that we've got to get better at explaining in real time, as we talked about last time. As the dying is progressing, we need to describe it better. But the other lot of correspondence that I hadn't foreseen was people saying, okay, you've convinced me we need to talk about this stuff, but I don't know where to start. Or I'm trying to talk to my adult children about the fact that I'm in my 90s and I won't live forever, and they keep closing me down. Or, you know, if we start this conversation, does it mean then that the whole family's conversations will be forever changed because death is in the room with us? Or, you know, just that kind of feeling of this is important, this is precious, but it's daunting, it's frightening. I might get the timing wrong, I might not be the right person. And these letters came not just from everyday folks, if you like, the people I'd written the first book for, they came from healthcare professionals. Is it my job to do this? What if I upset people? What if somebody makes a complaint? What if it's beyond my role and job description? So remarkably similar letters, whether people were working in healthcare for a living or experiencing healthcare as patients or families of patients. And I realised that actually, you know, as a person who's worked in palliative care for so long, but also as a cognitive therapist and just as a human being, really, I've got lots and lots of experience of those conversations. So I went back to my publishers and said, I think I might have the idea here for another book. And they said, hooray, yes, marvellous, but we don't want another book about death. Okay, that's a bit awkward because that is, in fact, what I do, what I know. But of course, from my cognitive therapy practice and just from being a person who's aware of these things about the way we communicate, but just living an everyday life with family and friends, experiencing everything from birth to death and everything in between, it wasn't difficult to actually pull the stories from a wide range of experiences across the lifespan. I don't think it's a secret from reading the book, though, that this is a person who's definitely worked in palliative and end-of-life care. But it's not a deathly book in the same way that With the End in Mind was. So that's how it came to be.
Well, thank goodness it came to be, is all I can say. I mean, it's wonderful. But what I remember asking you about this in the first interview, that the stories, and you said that you came from a storytelling family and that you had kept stories throughout your career. And now I'm going to say, you know, are you going to write a memoir? Are you going to just write a storybook? Because this book, it teaches people so much, but it does it through stories, which is what I think is your superpower, you know, that you collect and you create and you make these stories so captivating to be able to bring those lessons to people. So how does that fit? Are you going to write another storybook, please? Can we have another storybook?
Well, it turns out that I really like writing. I really do.
You're very good at
enjoy
it.
the writing. And I'm starting to be able to write, you know, because I've retired from medicine really well and properly now. I went back for a little while during COVID, but I am back into retirement again. And now when I'm filling in forms to go places and it asks what your job is, I hover over that box for a little while, but I am now able to write the word writer or author in that box and not feel too much of an imposter. So yes, I do like writing, and I am still writing. I'm not writing a book at the moment, but I'm writing for pleasure and I'm thinking of ideas. So who knows, maybe there might be a 3-pack.
the stories are so powerful. I mean, I was in tears several times reading your book, and most of the time I'm out walking and listening. So I'm walking along and there's tears
Oh
pooling in
dear.
my eyes, like, oh,
Oh
okay,
dear.
blink, blink, blink. No, it's not an oh dear, because one of the beautiful stories you tell is about the power of tears. You talk about a nurse who talks to you about feeling ashamed that they had not stayed professional in their conversations with someone during COVID, and that actually you managed to show her that the tears were a powerful part of the conversation that she had with that particular family of the
Yeah,
patient.
I think it's really important. I've had leaky eyes my whole career, and it doesn't seem to have been a career impediment at all. I think you get the sense from the family that you're with how comfortable they are with how close to the surface emotions are and emotions are to be expressed. And I think that the closer their emotions are to the surface and to expression, maybe the more relaxed I am, and then maybe sometimes I'm teary when I'm explaining the mechanism of dying, for example. I don't think I've ever got through that without a lump in my throat and very often tears in my eyes. But there's something about being tearful in a conversation that I think says you're genuinely present and that this matters to you. And so for that story during COVID, for that lovely nurse, weeping as she's describing to the patient's wife down the phone how things are happening, what she was communicating to that wife, who at that stage in the pandemic wasn't allowed to visit, even though her husband was now sick enough to die, was that somebody who would weep is looking after my husband. He's not with me, and that's terrible, but he's placed in a place of care and compassion, and that's really, really important. So I think it is important that we can be genuine in our emotions. And of course, there are lots of people who are very genuine, but they're not weepers like I am. It doesn't matter. The genuineness, I think, communicates itself. It makes itself apparent. And when we are working really hard to bury our emotions, I think we come across as clipped and perfunctory and businesslike. Now, there are occasions when clipped and perfunctory and businesslike is exactly the attitude to take into, a business meeting, a decision-making meeting. But sometimes actually being emotionally open and even vulnerable is an important part even of a meeting that feels quite difficult. There's a story in the book about listening to a complaint from a family who felt that the death of a patient had been brought about by mismanagement of the patient at the hospital. And it was really, really important that that family felt listened to, felt that their concerns had been properly heard, and also that they had an opportunity to explore all of their misgivings without us leaping to being defensive. Because there's always something we can learn when we reflect on patient care. But what they were able to understand by the end of the meeting was there had been a cover-up, but the cover-up was that the patient himself didn't want his wife to be worried by how sick he was. And that's a terribly difficult position that a patient can put staff into by forbidding us to share information. But also that they were able to recognise that that was exactly the kind of guy he was. It was a decision based on love and kindness and concern for his family, not secrecy and subterfuge and disguising things. So they were able to recognise the person that they knew and to recognise that we were describing the person that they knew, and we'd really met and respected who he was, even though it meant that when eventually the end of his life came, they were less prepared than they might have been because of some decisions he'd made. But to help them not to think that we were blaming him or we were shifting the blame somewhere else, there was no blame. It was just everybody doing their best, and it added up to a situation that left them ill prepared for the catastrophe that happened to this patient. but there, you know, being very tearful would not have been appropriate, but neither would have it have been appropriate to be entirely businesslike and, you know, there as a representative to defend my organisation, rather than to really listen to what we can learn from the feedback from this family.
I thought that story was actually, it was like a masterclass in how to have a professional, tender conversation. It was very, very powerful how the hospital team working together, but you know, being open, being vulnerable, being honest, were able to move the wife from her initial just so closed, so defensive. She believed that the hospital had killed her husband, to at the end being able to realize that no, that wasn't the case, and that she, in the space of, I don't know how long the meeting actually was, but in the space of that story, she went on her own journey of coming to acceptance of what had happened. And that was so powerful. And I was going to ask you about that particular story because it was very interesting for me. And I want to get back into more of the detail of the book in a moment, but just because you've raised this particular story, you came out of that experience with your own sense of anger. And as I like women's rights, I would like to ask you why you had that sense of anger.
The meeting went so well because it was chaired by a very senior retired surgeon, somebody who I'd been a medical student of in my formative years, somebody who I'd been actually quite frightened of as a student and as a young doctor, but who'd had, you know, those kind of life experiences that happened to us all that had smoothed some of his crusty angles, and he now really was an elder, and fairness was a really important value for him. So he held that meeting in a way that said to the family, this is going to be completely transparent, it's going to be completely fair, and I'm not going to let anybody here shout at anybody else, so we will listen to you, but I'm going to manage this meeting so that also we will need you to make space to listen to us. So fair, courteous, kind, generous, and he made sure that he introduced everybody in the room. He used my title, which doesn't always happen. This is Dr Kathryn Mannix, and this is Mr Max. I can't remember what names we gave people because everybody's names have been changed for the story, but the name of the surgeon, and you know, surgeons who've passed their surgical exams become Mr. if they're men, and can elect to be Miss or Mrs. or remain Doctor if they're women. And then the lady from the complaints department, Enid, who spent hours and hours getting copies of things from the notes and the letters and making sure that we all had them so we were properly briefed well enough in advance. So this is Enid from the complaints department who's organised the meeting for us, and we're very grateful to her. So you know, courteous in naming the person who wasn't sitting at the table. She was sitting slightly away, making notes, making sure that there were beverages, those sorts of things. But because I've been at medical meetings where there's a different way of introducing men and women, so that men will very often be introduced as Professor or Mr. or Sir or whatever, and then I'll be introduced as, oh, this is our lovely palliative care consultant, Kathryn Mannix, and I don't get my title. Now, actually, I don't care about my title, but I care that the title of everybody is equal to everybody else's. So if they're not going to give me my title, that's not a problem, as long as they've introduced the surgeon as our lovely vascular surgeon Mike Smith, rather than the eminent Professor Sir Michael Smith, when I get, this is Kath. So I clocked that this lovely professor, who I think you can tell I admire immensely, gave us our equivalent titles around the table, but didn't even give Enid her surname. And maybe it was a tender nerve, I don't remember. Maybe I'd recently been at another one of those meetings where people didn't get introduced properly. or didn't get introduced equally. But that day, it just rankled. And because the rest of the meeting had ended in such a conciliatory way, really felt that that family left not just better informed, but consoled by what they'd discovered during the meeting. So we were all in a safe place as we left. Everybody else had gathered their papers. I thought, actually, this thing that's now burning inside me, this what happened compared with what should have happened, which always is the trigger to anger. It's a feeling of unfairness, a feeling that there's a should or a shouldn't going on in there. He should have given Enid her surname. And we can use anger rather than just to make an explosion. We can use it to be a kind of motor that moves us through the difficult transaction of talking about the thing that's made us angry. And so I decided that I would challenge him. And then found myself hovering on the edge of, this. Before we go, there's something else I'd like to speak to you about. But, I felt the meeting went really well, and it was great. And I loved the way you gave me my proper title, because I think it's really important that the family know that they've got very senior people taking them very seriously. I could just hear myself going, blather, 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 blather. And in my head, there's this voice saying, you're going to have to say it. You've started now. You've stepped over the threshold. You have to say it. So I said to him that I couldn't help but notice that he hadn't given Enid her surname, and that actually she was a really, really important, integral part of the process that had enabled us to hold that complaints meeting, and perhaps she would also like to be accorded that same dignity. Can't remember the exact wording now. And then I kind of stopped and thought, now what will happen now? Will he just erupt? Will he feel that, his medical student of old is challenging him or correcting him? And he was just lovely. And he stopped, he thought about it, he said, you know what? I don't think I'd even thought about it. I don't think I'd even noticed I was doing it. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning it. I'll try and do better. And as is often the case, when you really screw your courage to the max to do something you think is going to be so hard, actually, it was almost as though nothing had happened, except something really important had happened. And then he continued to be his courteous self. He held the door open for me so that I could walk through it first, and invited me to go for a cup of coffee with him before I went back to my clinic. So clearly there was no harm done to our relationship. He was going to continue to behave in his gentlemanly way. I know there are women who don't like men to hold a door open for them. I just think having a convention that makes sure we don't bump into each other is helpful. So that's a useful one. But it made me feel again that we sometimes overthink how difficult it is to challenge somebody who's being actually, I guess, casually othering, whether that's sexism or racism. I don't think there's malice aforethought in it. It's that they haven't even noticed. And it's because of privilege. It's because they haven't ever needed to think about it. But often they're very open to noticing it without feeling humiliated, if we've got the courage to point it out, and if we can do that gracefully rather than blamingly. So I would like to think that he has gone on to be just a little bit more aware of the way he introduces everybody, because I don't know whether Enid didn't get her surname because she was a woman or because she wasn't a doctor. But either way, there was a lack of equality of human beings in that room. And I think he'll think about it in the future.
And also, he'll probably notice it in the future if other people do it.
Yes, indeed.
So that's the ripple effect of you having spoken up, isn't it? So important. I love that bit. I was like, yes, because I've seen it so many times. And I think it is usually, it's women, and it's the difference between the so-called professional woman and the administrative staff. And yet when you're a woman, you often get assumed to be the administrative staff as well. So it's a double whammy. But so kudos to you for pointing it out. I mean, it's so, so important. We have to have parity in these things, don't we? We
Well,
really
we
do.
do, but I think also kudos to him for taking it with such grace. I think that's worth
Yes.
pointing out, that actually I have never felt that I was his equal, because he was so eminent, so widely published, so internationally famous, so and he'd been one of my trainers, and we're always in awe, aren't we, of people who've trained us. But he treated me like an equal in that conversation, and that was graceful of him too.
So going back to sort of the structure of the book, so it's about how to have the tender conversations, but actually it's listening that brings about the tender conversation. So what are some of the things that you talk about to enable people to listen more?
So when I started writing the book, lots of the correspondence was about, if I could just get my dad to sit down and stop putting it off, I could tell him what he needs to know, and we'd be on the same page, and it would be sorted out. And that kind of tone of message. And it all seemed to be about people saying, yeah, we need to have these conversations, and it's all about us being able to give each other a really good talking to. So I think that was my starting point, pivoting on that starting point of, actually, if all we do is talk at each other, nothing will change. It's all about the listening. So when I went back to my publishers and said, I think I might have a book here, and I know what it's going to be called, and it's going to be called Listen, they actually got right behind that straight away, albeit it mustn't be a death book. They could see that this was a pivot, that this is a flag being planted that says there's something about these conversations that's important, and it's probably not the thing that you're expecting. It's not what you say. It isn't the words. And that's why the subtitle is How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations, because it isn't about working out what to say. If we bring ourselves to be really present to what the other person is telling us, only then, as we're listening, will we realize what it is that we need to talk about. And then the words will bubble up, because we're all intrinsically linguistic people. Once we know what we want to talk about, the words come out of our mouths. That's what happens. That's what we're doing now. So it seemed to me that what I needed to try and define was, what's the skill set that brings people to that. And to start off with, I thought I was going to write it like a toolkit. I could even envisage, the cover of the book like a yellow toolkit with these black bands on it. And then I realized, that doesn't really work, does it? Because when you're sticking up a shelf, you're the only person with agency. You're doing it. And you pick up one tool and you do something, and then you put that tool down, you pick the next tool up to do the next thing in the sequence. And you're deciding what the sequence is, and you're in control and you're in charge. And oh my goodness, that's like the opposite of what I'm trying to say here.
Opposite of listening.
Because this isn't doing something to somebody. This is working alongside somebody together in collaboration. This is a cooperative effort. And in fact, when we're in a really important conversation, we are paying attention, we're listening, we're using body language as well as words, we're comparing and contrasting what we know about this person today with maybe other occasions when we've seen them. How are they looking? How do they seem to be feeling? So we're focusing on their body language as well. There's so many things going on all at the same time. It's not just one tool. It's not just hammer, nail, wall, bang. So the idea that maybe dance could be a good metaphor began to emerge, because if we dance with each other, we're both making the dance work. And we do move backwards and forwards. We create space. There are pauses. Sometimes there are fancy moves, but mainly it's just the same moves in different directions, and it's easy. Sometimes we fall over, or we stumble, or we trip, but we don't blame each other for that. We kind of hold on to each other and hold each other up and try and recover and keep the dance going. And that's very much what happens in a really important conversation as well, that it's possible for somebody to say something in a clumsy way and the other person to go, oh no, sorry, I didn't mean that. That came out wrong. It didn't sound like that in my head. And we can help each other to get back on course again. So it seemed to me that the skill set boiled down to, how do we create the space that allows us to listen to each other? And that means that actually we come into the conversation more intent on understanding the other person than intent on making our own view the view of the whole conversation by the time we've finished. So that means that you forget about what to say. You come in with an attitude of being curious about how this situation is from the other person's point of view. And then you can comment on the bits that seem the same to you, or, you know, how interesting that you should take that view because it feels completely different to that for me. Here's how it feels for me. So we're not saying, oh, you're wrong. We're saying we're not the same. Let's look at where we are the same. Let's look at where we're not the same. So the suggestions are things like that we listen to understand rather than listening to speak. So I ask you a question, you tell me your answer. I think about what you've just said to me and I'm curious about it, and I might ask you another question to just maybe go a little bit deeper or to expand it more broadly. And then just to be sure that what I think I've heard you say is what you thought you meant, I offer you a summary back of, in my words now, what I think you said so far. So I'm just checking before we go on into the conversation that I haven't already lost the plot. And that's an expression of humility, that I'm not in charge here. I'm hoping to hold us in parallel here as we have this conversation. So curiosity is based on questions rather than assumptions. It's based on wondering rather than knowing. And when you watch really fantastic communicators at work, what you see is quite a lot of silence, quite a lot of wondering and being curious and asking questions rather than finger wagging and telling and giving information. And that the silence often pivots things. So there'll be a silence at a particular point, and when the person speaks next, the person who's being listened to, you realise they've made a little journey during the silence, because silence is where the work happens. And something that's really interesting in medical communication skills training, we'll often do video training. So trainee doctor or nurse or whoever will be having a conversation with a patient and they video it. And then afterwards, we look at the video together and they'll say, oh, there's about 2 minutes in, there's this deafening silence. It's so awkward. I couldn't think what to say. It lasted forever. And in fact, it probably lasted, a long silence might be 10 seconds. But when you talk to the patient about that conversation and you ask about that silence, they say, what silence? Because for them, they were entirely occupied with the thinking, wondering, pulling things together, weaving of the tapestry of information, if you like. So for them, that wasn't a silence. If you weren't talking right then, they didn't really even notice that you weren't talking. What they noticed was that they were pulling things together, that was their opportunity for thinking. So silence is our friend in these conversations. And that if we are going to have conversations that are very emotional, that towards the end of that conversation, we need to just steady ourselves and get ourselves ready to leave the conversation, rather than having taken all of our kind of emotional protection off and then leaving still completely raw. It's like you put your coat on before you go back out into the cold, really. And then the other thing is just a thing to think about for people who are supporting other people, whether that's a professional role or whether in your family you're the person that people turn to when there are crises and difficulties, and every family's got that person. Because it's work, it's laborious, it is tiring, it is emotionally depleting. So whether we're doing it professionally or whether we're doing it because we're the person in our friendship group or family that does that, we need to look after ourselves. Otherwise, we will run out of energy and then we won't be any use to them or to ourselves. So a little bit about self-care as well.
I liked as well the way you described, certainly on at least 2 occasions, you gave examples of how to bring someone to awareness and knowledge without telling them anything, to elicit it coming from them. And that was really powerful, because again, it's about them reaching their own conclusions and them having the space to think. There was the instance in the car with the daughter and the dad, and then there was the instance of the foster son. And those again were sort of masterclasses in how to bring someone to an understanding without forcing anything down their throat, or telling them too soon. That particularly with the foster son, it was, how much can this person take? And also the brother who had the 3 sisters and their mother, and the conversation they had to have with, well, he wanted to have with her, the mother, but the sister didn't want to. And it was about feeling the way to see how much information is possible,
Yeah.
and how much the person wants to know and how much they can deal with. I thought that was, again, it was so powerful to sort of, as it's not a toolkit obviously, but the stories are so good at giving examples of how one might approach a scenario if one finds oneself in
That's
that.
lovely to hear. Thank you. And it's so that the dad in the car story. There's a little debt to a writer called Garrison Keillor in that story. I don't know whether you know. Garrison Keillor writes
Yes, I
about
do.
an
Yeah.
imaginary community in northern Minnesota called Lake Wobegon, and they are wonderful books and
Mm.
wonderful characters. And in one of his stories, a mum of a young family has one night out a week when she goes to choir practice, and dad's left at home with the children, and he's finishing giving them their dinner, and then they play a chasing game around the table, but they haven't cleared the table, and the dog jumps up and he knocks the gravy boat over. And so the mum is just at the garden gate, having had her one night out a week, and she's about to walk into a house that is utter mayhem, gravy everywhere, gravy bespattered children, the whole of the dining room disrupted. And Garrison Keillor uses this lovely device where he stands on the brink of the gate with this woman and imagines the scene that she's going to walk into, and then says, but the writer is going to take her for a walk around the block. And so the dad suddenly realized, yikes, it's nearly time for her to be home, chucks the boys in the bath, cleans the dog, tidies the house. So by the time she's walked around the block, the potential disaster has been averted. So the story about the dad in the car, the dad is picking his daughter up on a Friday evening. She's finished school. She then goes and watches the school teams play football. And then there's a social evening in the sports centre where the kids all get together in the coffee bar. And so he picks her up and he starts to drive her home. It's dark and he can see she's on her phone and she's looking a bit miserable. And he starts off really well, just commenting, this is something on your mind, and I'd listen if you wanted to talk. And she starts to tell him that the other kids had laughed at her shoes. And he's a dad, he loves this teenage daughter, and he'd been wondering, was this heartbreak? Was it she was in trouble with a teacher? Had she had some kind of awful row with a friend? Oh, and it's only shoes. Oh, thank goodness, it's only shoes, sweetheart. He says, we can go shopping at the weekend and sort that out. And his daughter thinks, well, if he can't even understand about the shoes, how can I possibly tell him about everything else? And what I'm trying to illustrate is how our best intentions of jumping in, offering a solution, reassuring somebody that nothing's really that bad, closes down the space for what the bad thing is and how bad it is to them, even if it doesn't seem very bad to us. So I went back to the beginning and I let him drive around the block because he was a little bit early. I brought him back into the car park and we started exactly the same way. But this time he doesn't close her down by reassuring, and a completely different conversation begins. And so one of the things that is really key when we're listening isn't just what we do, but it's what we don't do. We don't think this is so simple, I can just fix it in a sentence. I can take you shopping and we'll solve that. What you need to do is, it's all about staying grounded, letting them think. And then that thing you were talking to before about people being able to discover their own solutions, that method of questioning where we just ask questions that they know the answers to. This is how Socrates taught his students, by asking them questions either he knew already they knew the answer to, or that they would be able to deduce the answer to from stuff that he knew they already knew. So Socratic questioning, asking questions that help people to start to formulate the different aspects of the conundrum that they find themselves with, so that they can start to see what they already know, what actions are already possible, what action they might need to take in order to be able to take a bigger step or something like that. So they then become the person who designs the solution to their problem, instead of having somebody else come in and tell them what to do or rescue them. And how hard that is when the person with the dilemma is someone we love, and especially someone we love who we're in a protective role with. So whether that's one of our children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, our godchildren, people who are students that we're responsible for, trainees, members of staff in our own teams, we've got to step backwards. We've got to get over ourselves and let them be the person that solves this.
It just reminded me, and you talk about the eye contact, and that, you know, we sometimes assume that you've got to have eye contact, but actually looking away enables people to talk. And many people will know this if they've had teenagers, you know, I've had some of my best conversations with my son when I'm driving and he's sitting in the car next to me, and I'm not looking him in the eye, because if I'm looking him in the eye, he's like, I'm looking away, I'm not having this, you know. So it's just little things like that to remember, you know. It's so important.
Absolutely right. And if you're drumming up for a conversation that you know is important and significant but feels a little bit daunting with somebody that you know well enough, you can ask them whether they'd like to go for a walk while you talk. Because now there is a third player, which is the environment in which you're walking. So the silences feel less awkward because maybe you're watching spring happening, or maybe you're navigating across a crossing in a road and there's lots of people coming in the other direction. You're trying not to bump into them. So now you can build pauses in, and the actual action of the walking is itself something that's quite calming to the nervous system. So it helps to deal with the tension that you feel when, you know, like I knew when I was going to have that conversation with the prof, I could feel the tension making my muscles need to do something. And if I'd had them, I'd have been shuffling papers or hopping from foot to foot, really as a kind of self-soothing. So go for a walk and you will be able to soothe yourself and take slower, deeper breaths and just feel less agitated as you try to have this conversation that you know is really important. You know, I need to talk to my life partner about the fact that the money that's in the bank account doesn't really match what I thought our spending had been recently. Or, you know, we've had the school report for our middle child and they're clearly not flourishing. What's going on here? We need to talk about this thing that's going to make us feel agitated and anxious. Let's use walking maybe, or being in a a place of comfort be one of the tools we use to enable us to have this conversation more easily.
And another, well, it was all powerful. Every page was powerful, but towards the end, you really brought home to me how difficult it was during COVID, because specifically because of the restrictions on communication, not just the distance, but the masks and the PPE, and not being able to do the things that you could do. And when you were talking to the nurse and you said that, you were 2 meters apart in the cafeteria talking to her, and there were people out in the parking lot who would have given their left arm to have 2 meters distance between themselves and their own loved one. That was so powerful. So perhaps you can talk just a little bit to that, the challenges of trying to communicate during the pandemic.
So during COVID, doctors who were recently retired were offered re-registration by the General Medical Council. And we had to be fairly recently retired because they wanted us to be safe. So I went back to a big, busy hospital and community trust that I used to work for. And rather than have me as a bedside doctor, they wanted to use me as a kind of wisdom person, staff support and teaching communication skills, because lots of staff, of course, were having to look after dying people, talk about the fact that they were dying, perhaps with them, perhaps with their families, whose day job before COVID had nothing at all to do with dying. They might have been working in the foot clinic, looking at people with, bunions and sore feet. And now here they were, bedside of dying people. So it was really important that we found ways to give them the skills that they needed and then really support them through looking after these people. Because the thing that staff found the most difficult was, until a little bit of visiting was allowed if someone was so sick that we thought they were dying, the only person that patients saw would be staff. And each one of those staff members, I had the same conversation, I don't know how many times, of people realizing that although they were doing their best, they were not the right person. They just weren't the person in the room that person wanted, that patient wanted to have with them at that important time. And so they always felt that in some way they, as individuals, on behalf of us as the health service, were letting those dying people down. And they felt that all day, every day. Their hearts were breaking, and it was so hard to listen to. So my job was partly staff support, and I bumped into this nurse who I'd already known because before I'd retired, she'd been a student nurse in our palliative care team. And it was lovely to see her now all, qualified and with her uniform on. And the first thing that I noticed was that she had rubbed skin over the bridge of her nose and over the top of her cheeks, where she was wearing a much harder ventilator mask when she was behind the doors in the ward where she was working. And of course, she'd be wearing that mask, and then she'd have a visor over the top of that. She'd be wearing a cap over her hair. She'd be wearing scrubs, and then she'd be wearing a plastic apron. If she was beside a patient, she might well be wearing an operating gown on top of everything else. So it was a magnificent spring, wasn't it, of our first lockdown, and it was hot. And British hospitals in the north of England are built to keep people warm in the winter. They're not built to keep people cool in the summer, because that's not a problem we have. But people under all of those layers in confined spaces, it was a really, really difficult, physically uncomfortable way of working. And then to be emotionally uncomfortable at the same time, to be seeing deaths in the sort of numbers that we don't see in peacetime. This was like working in a field hospital where people are too sick to save, and they're dying in numbers on your ward every single day. Whereas most wards might have a death a week, a death a month, not several deaths every single day. So it was a really interesting job to do. I felt a little bit guilty that I wasn't bedside because I wasn't taking the same risks that my colleagues were taking, but I also understood that I could help more people by helping staff who each were helping lots of people than to be a staff member with just my one caseload. So I kind of made my peace with it, but I did feel a little bit guilty. And I also felt a little bit guilty that I felt relieved that I wasn't taking the risk that they were taking. But they were magnificent. And when we were doing the communication skills training, we brought them into a lecture theatre rather than doing it online, because it was designed for newly qualified doctors, doctors who'd taken qualification early in order to step up for the COVID effort. They'd missed their last few consolidation months at medical school, so they knew all the theory, but they hadn't had so much of the practice that most newly qualified doctors would have. And also there was a cohort of newly qualified nurses. So we designed a communication skills training, and they came into the lecture theatre. They had to wear their masks. They were sitting socially distanced from each other in the lecture theatre. But what we were asking them to do was practice the skills of listening and practicing the skills of explaining the process of dying, which is exactly what you and I talked about last time I was talking to you for your podcast. So 2 different training sessions, and they worked in threes to practice one person being a patient or a family member, one person being themselves in their role, and one person being the observer who was just noticing what they were doing, were they on task as they'd been asked to be, and they were all just given 5 minutes of that and then swap round, give it another go, all in a different role. So each person saw it from 3 different angles. They had a go at using the skills, and they understood then how much you feel this impulse to console, to fix, to offer explanations. You're phoning a family to say that somebody's dying or that somebody's died. You want to tell them everything we tried. And actually, it's irrelevant. You've told them the terrible news, and now you need to just be quiet and let them take that in. This is the point at which silence is doing the work. And what was really interesting was noticing different professions having different levels of comfort with silence. So the nurses were better at holding silence generally than the doctors were generally. Physios were much more uncomfortable with silence than occupational therapists, which I found really interesting. That the social workers and the psychologists were much more comfortable with holding silence, and that depending on what area and discipline of medicine people worked in, the more highly interventionist it was, the more those people wanted to keep on talking and putting things right. So, you know, the orthopedic surgeons and the anaesthetists who do stuff and respond to a crisis by steadying the boat to stop the crisis, they wanted to keep doing. Whereas the general practitioners, the district nurses, palliative care people, much more comfortable with the idea that there's silence happening here. This person's experiencing distress, and my task here is to be their companion in their distress, because it can't be fixed. All I can do is help them to hold it. So it was a very, very interesting, very, very challenging experience. But what happened was that a communication skills training that we designed for these very junior staff, word spread. And within 6 weeks, we were having requests from really senior staff. People from the intensive care units were coming, people from the respiratory ward were coming. And the thing is that because the skills apply to all of us in any circumstances, when you come along and do the skills practice, you practice at your own level. So you could have a trio where there was a medical student and a consultant in intensive care and a very experienced post-surgery physiotherapist in a trio. Each of them, when it was their turn for skills practice, would practice at their own level with the kinds of conversations that fell to them in their role. But each of them had the experience of listening and observing the other people in their trio and just imagining how it could be in those different scenarios. So it was a really rich experience for everybody.
Sounds amazing, and yeah, gosh, if you felt guilty, imagine the rest of the population, goodness, who were not there and not doing these things. Now, I could talk to you forever, but I know we're short of time, so I suppose just finally, what would you most like to leave my listeners with?
I think the task of tender listening when a person has a real dilemma that they need to work through is not to fix it, not to make it better, not to reassure, but to turn up and be somebody's companion in distress and to say to them, I know this is hard. I know I don't know the answer, but I'm here, I'm with you, and I'm listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.